So today we're going to look at shaft flex. Now it's something that's often talked about as a major part in what creates consistency and directional consistency. However, what does it really do? Most people think that a stiffer shaft makes the ball go right, and a softer shaft for a right-hander, and a softer shaft makes the ball go left, helps the club head close, and a firmer shaft stops it closing. But why is that? But most importantly, what actually happens. I think this is one of the most misunderstood elements of shafts out there, and we're going to talk a little bit about what actually happens, but most importantly, why it happens, to give you a real understanding of what flex truly does. So in terms of how flex is measured, there's obviously a letter on most shafts, so an X on this one. The TBT doesn't have that, just the way they structure their shafts is a little bit different, but essentially this would be an A flex if it was in the conventional flexes. So we've got 4 flex ranges between them. The other method is by clamping the butt end of the shaft, oscillating and measuring that frequency, so the cycles per minute, of which there is 43 cycles per minute difference between these two. So we've got a really big difference in what is regarded as flex between the two shafts. What are we going to see performance-wise? So say conventionally, most beliefs would be that the softer shaft kicks the head through, squares the face up, and if you go too soft, it makes it go left. And if you go too stiff, because it doesn't recover as much, the face doesn't close and it goes right. But is that really what happens? If we think about how the shaft actually works in the swing, put that to one side for one moment, that requires the shaft to do a lot of rotation. Now, most of the force that's in the shaft, as you start down, as we swing to the top, as we start down, the loading on the shaft is actually this way, so toe up. So assuming we're on plane. So as we start down, the shaft bows and loads that way, and then as we come through, and there's a little bit of that rotation around us, then it twists a little bit open and then recovers a little bit, but it is not rotating that way. It's kind of more of an underneath release. So there is a little bit of toe round rotation, but it's actually more up, it's more of a kind of a diagonal across that way, rather than totally up, down, totally back forward, because it's working in 3 dimensions rather than 2. So that's one of the biggest misconceptions, and why that soft shaft creates a hook isn't necessarily correct. It doesn't stop it happening, and maybe augments it a little bit, but it is not the difference between a square club face at impact and a 5 degrees closed one. So that's really, that's ultimately one of the biggest misconception about what a shaft actually does. And so it doesn't flap the toe around. Otherwise, you wouldn't see some of the long drive guys using actually that particular shaft. These are people who swing at 150 mile an hour club speed. That's what some of the strongest swingers at your club will get in ball speed. So they are that strong in club head speed and that strong in movement, but are using an A-flex shaft. So flex in its conventional form and how it's thought of isn't as relevant as we once thought. Again, go back to a single flex range. Between these there are 4, and it's 20% of the bending of the shaft. Between a reg and a stiff, you're looking at 5%. So it can't do that much to the overall performance. When you strip it back and look at the actual numbers and the relevance of it, a regular to a stiff flex, or a stiff to an X, or an A to an R flex, it's not doing enough to make that big a difference to the overall shot pattern. But what does change as you move through the flexes is 90% of shafts get heavier as you get stiffer, and that's really what happens. But comparing 2 very, very similar shafts, one an X flex, one a soft regular, I'm going to hit them both, and we're going to look at what actually happens in terms of numbers, but also what it means from a feel point of view, because that ultimately is the biggest difference. So starting with the X flex, which for me, being at around 107, 108 mile an hour club speed, in principle is the more relevant one. So what it is for shafts and clubs that I'm used to hitting, it's more familiar feel. So a little bit of a tighter feel. My miss historically has been left. So going back to what we've always historically thought, playing a stiffer, tighter feeling shaft is just a more comfortable feel. In theory, it doesn't feel like it's going left, therefore it gives me more confidence to hit with. So the stiffer, tighter, firmer feel is something that I'm just more used to. So I'm going to get a couple of shots with this, and then look at the data, and then hit the softer one and compare that. So both of these are 15 odd grams lighter than I use. So I've got to make slight adjustments to my timing, but there again, very, as with the whiteboard profile, very tip stiff, designed to be low torque, solid, stable feeling. Very stiff on the tip section. It's a very solid feeling through the ball, and certainly to swing with as I build speed, I'm not noticing lots of lag and load through that midsection. So it's a very solid sensation to hit with. Look at the numbers. Okay, so 12.5 launch, 2.4 on spin. So let's do one more there. Yeah, so from a feel point of view, really stays very connected through the whole club. I don't get that sensation of movement down the bottom end. So because it's what I'm used to, I can just move through the shot and carry on hitting. So that one's a little higher on the face, so 14 launch, 2000 spin, but you know, both of those down the middle. So when we swap over, I'll just get the wrench here. So I measured these, there's literally 1 gram between them. Swing weight wise, less than half a point difference. So very, very, very similar from a static measurements point of view, other than the flex. Very, very similar shafts. Now they'll feel totally different to swing with. So, and this is where flex ultimately primarily plays a part in how the player wants to get the feel from the club, what's more comfortable. So you get some players that like me, that kind of tighter, firmer feel, because it's what I'm familiar with. It feels more controlled because of what I'm used to. And there are other players that want to get a little bit of load and kick out the shaft. So that shaft would feel a bit dead, a bit lifeless, and you have to fight the performance out of it. This one, if this shows up, if I wobble it around, you can see there's an awful lot of give and bend and essentially movement through that shaft. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to be a stable delivery of the club head, but I'm going to get a lot more sensation of that bending and loading through that midsection. So again, kind of wobbling that around, you can see how much that bottom end's moving. But what it's not doing is it's not flipping over, it's back and forth. So there's a lot of, based on high quality materials, there's a lot of structural stability within this shaft. So whilst it's very soft, it's a very, very high grade set of materials that goes into this. So actually the structural stability at impact relevant to flex is incredibly high. But the experience to swing with, as I start to move down, I'm going to feel a lot more movement in this. So for me in this test, I've got to basically try and ignore that and move through it, so it's just my swing going through the shot and not reacting to the feel. When we're fitting, we're absolutely looking for that reaction to the product because the player's got to feel comfortable with it. But as the purpose of this test, I'm going to try and ignore it as much as possible. So, to all intents and purposes, identical setups other than the flex. So, just ignore the softer feel and hit through the line. So, club speed, we're at 109, so actually slightly higher club speed on that than the last one. And a little bit of, so I've shut the face down a little bit more. But what it's not doing, there's a hint more draw, and as we said earlier, there's a little bit more recovery. It will create a little bit more draw burst to it, but it's not suddenly rifling at 20 yards left. If I can do one more there, again, carry on with the swing rather than react to it. Yeah, so it's an incredibly different feel. I think that's the bit that really you notice as the player, is actually as you start down, the tendency is to, for me, if I feel it move more, I tend to stall out on it and back off it. That then, for me, would then create, stop with the body and then a bit of a wrap around with the hands. So yes, we've seen a little bit more face closure, which as the shaft kicks back and through, so it loads and unloads a little bit more, there's slightly more, or there's a good deal more lead lag bend. And so yes, that very slightly closes the face in the same way that with the sleeve settings, if you add loft, which essentially that bend's doing, there's a little bit more face closure. But we're not looking at uncontrollable shots. So if we go and have a look at the data, what we can see here from if we look at the shot patterns first and foremost, the stiffer shaft, very slight draw, very tight little right to left off the center line. The softer of the two shafts, there's still shot shape, really not a lot of shot shape in it. It's a bit of draw, but it's not uncontrollable. So the the big, I guess, big thing that's leveled at soft shaft flex is that, oh, it's inconsistent. Well, if we look at the face to path numbers, I'll put the analysis screen on here. The two at the bottom are 0.9, 0.9 face to path numbers. They're identical to the stiffer shaft. The softer one, there's only 0.4 of a difference in terms of face to path number. Now, that is as much me as it is the shaft. Now we can see, yes, fortunately I'm not overly variable with my data. So club path identical with this shaft for both swings, identical with the stiffer shaft for both swings. And if I put the amount of shot shape on here as well, the amount of curve. So average curve with the stiffer shaft, 12 foot. Average curve with the softer shaft, 39 foot. So there's another 8 yards or so of shot shape on there. But that's under a third of the fairway. So it's not like we're seeing arrow straight from one and a raking hook from the other. We're actually seeing a gentle draw out of one and pretty much dead straight out the other. So it's not vastly different data. We are seeing a little bit more spin with the softer shaft, and that's what I'd expect to see. Again, going back to that shaft bend, we're seeing more loft delivered, therefore dynamically a little bit more flight, a little bit more spin. Launch angles, again, averages between the two. With the stiffer shaft, we're looking at 13.4 launch, 2.2 on spin. With the softer shaft, 13.8 and 2.6. So it's the spin which has gone up predominantly. That's the biggest overall change in terms of what you're really going to see. There's a little bit more draw bias, but there's a bit more spin and flight. So in terms of when we're looking at the 4 flex ranges of difference into 2 shafts, that alone we're seeing 20% of difference on spin, and we're seeing about a 6 or 7 yard more variation in shot shape. But it's not gone from an arrow straight shot to an uncontrollable shot. It's gone from a stiffer, slightly straighter shot to a stiffer feeling shaft, and more stable feel through the swing, and a marginal draw to a much, much softer feel and a little bit more draw, but not wildly different one to the other. So there are going to be some players that will love the feel of this. There are going to be others that will hate the feel of this, and vice versa. There are going to be some who are going to love the stability of this and it'll feel more comfortable, but there'll be others that'll hate it. But actually, nuts and bolts difference, there's a little bit more spin and there's a hair more draw, but it's not uncontrollable differences, which we've been led to believe for so many years. And that's going off 4 flex ranges, let alone the one that most people believed would be the issue. So the takeaway from this is there is a marginal difference that comes from a wide change in flex, but don't pick a shaft based on a reg or a stiff or an X. Pick it on, does it work? Can you deliver it consistently? Does it give you stable shot data? Not just on the letter on the shaft.